The first shot cracked through the canyon like dry timber snapping in a winter stove. And that was when Colt Maddox knew the day had turned mean. The sky above the red cliffs of Arizona, hanging heavy and pale like it did before trouble. His horse snorting beneath him as the echo rolled across the rocks and died slow. And down on the narrow trail below he saw her, a lone woman in a blue riding dress flecked with dust, her bonnet torn loose by the wind. 3 bandits closing in behind her with the lazy confidence of men who believed the world already belonged to them. And Colt did not sigh or curse. He just nudged his horse forward. Because some men ride toward Gunfire, and some ride away. And he had long ago chosen which kind he was. Her horse stumbled on loose gravel, almost throwing her, and the men behind laughed loud enough to carry up the canyon walls, one firing again just to watch her flinch, and she twisted in the saddle with fear in her eyes, but not surrender. That was the first thing Colt noticed, even from that distance. The way she held herself straight, despite the chaos, as if pride was stitched into her spine. And when she spotted him on the ridge, she did not scream or wave wildly. She only stared, as though measuring him, judging whether he was salvation or another wolf, come to circle her. Colt slid his rifle from the saddle sheath in one smooth motion, the sun catching the worn metal, and he did not shout a warning, did not offer mercy, because bandits who chase a lone rider through canyon passes have already chosen their road. He aimed at the man in the rear, the one laughing the loudest, and squeezed the trigger. The report snapping sharp and clean, the bandit tumbling from his saddle before his laughter had time to fade, and the other 2 reined in hard, confusion flashing across their faces as they searched the cliffs for the ghost who had struck them. Gunfire answered him, bullets chipping stone near his boots, but Colt was already moving, urging his horse down the slope in a controlled slide. Dust rising thick around him, he fired again, grazing the shoulder of the second man, sending him spinning sideways in pain. And the last bandit cursed and bolted, choosing life over loot, dragging his wounded partner away as they fled the canyon bend, leaving the woman alone in a cloud of powder smoke and echoing silence, her horse trembling, her hands white on the reins. When Colt reached her, he saw she was younger than he expected, though not soft, her eyes a stormy gray that held both fury and gratitude tangled tight together. She pushed her bonnet back with steady fingers and looked at the fallen bandit, then at Colt, as if deciding whether to thank him or blame him for the blood staining the rocks. And when she spoke, her voice was clear despite the tremor beneath it, asking his name not with sweetness but with demand. Like a woman used to being answered, Colt told her his name plain and simple, and asked hers in return, and she hesitated only a heartbeat before saying Eleanor Whitaker, from a ranch 2 days east near the dry riverbed folks called Mercy's Run. And there was a story in the way she said it. A history that rode behind her words like dust trails on the horizon. She explained the bandits had been trailing her since dawn, after she refused to hand over a leather satchel strapped tight behind her saddle, and Colt noticed the way her hand drifted back to that satchel unconsciously. Protective as a mother guarding a child, he asked what was worth dying over inside that bag, and she met his gaze without flinching, saying papers, deeds, proof that the land her family worked belonged to them and not to the men who had been circling like vultures for months. And as she spoke, the wind tugged at loose strands of her dark hair, framing a face too stubborn to bend easy. Colt felt something shift inside him, not desire, not yet, but a recognition of fire. He had seen it before, in wild mustangs that refused the rope, in settlers who carved homes from rock and heat, in people who would rather bleed than bow. Colt offered to escort her the rest of the way, telling himself it was only decent to see the job finished, to make sure the remaining bandits did not gather courage in return. But as they rode side by side through the narrowing canyon, the quiet between them thick and alive, he realized the trouble had not ended with the last gunshot, because every time Eleanor Whitaker glanced his way there was something unreadable in her expression, not fear, not relief, but curiosity edged with challenge. And Colt Maddox, who had guarded his solitude like a fortress since the war stole half his soul, felt the first crack appear in those walls, a small fracture caused not by bullets, but by the steady presence of a woman who refused to bow. And he did not yet know that saving her life would cost him something far more dangerous than blood. It would cost him his peace. They rode east as the sun leaned low, turning the desert gold and copper, the canyon widening into open land where sagebrush bent beneath a restless wind. And Colt kept his eyes moving across the horizon, watching for dust trails that might mean the bandits had gathered reinforcements, while Eleanor rode steady at his side, her posture proud despite the long day, the leather satchel tied firm behind her saddle like a promise she refused to break. And when he asked why she had ridden alone with something so valuable, she answered that men in town had already chosen sides, that fear had bought their silence, and she would not risk betrayal by trusting the wrong escort. Colt studied her profile in the fading light, noticing the tightness in her jaw when she spoke of town, and he understood the taste of betrayal better than most, having learned it in muddy trenches and empty homesteads long before he drifted into this stretch of Arizona. He told her the bandits would not forget the humiliation of losing one of their own, and she replied that men who steal land rarely forget anything that wounds their pride, and there was no tremble in her voice now, only resolve, as if danger were a familiar guest at her table by the time Mercy's Run came into view. Little more than a scattering of buildings near a dry riverbed, the sky had turned a bruised violet, and lanterns flickered alive one by one. Colt felt the weight of eyes upon them before they even reached the first fence line. Men leaning against posts, hands resting near holsters, women whispering from porch steps, news traveling faster than hoofbeats in small places like this. And when Eleanor dismounted in front of a modest ranch house with peeling white paint, she did not look at Colt for reassurance. She walked straight to the door, as if she owned the ground beneath her boots. An older man stepped out before she could knock, grey hair tied back, face carved by sun and years, his gaze sharp as a hawk's, and when he saw the dust on her dress and the rifle in Colt's saddle, he stiffened. Eleanor called him father and handed him the satchel without ceremony, telling him that deeds were safe, that the men who chased her had been turned back, and the old man's eyes shifted to Colt, measuring, weighing, judging whether this stranger had come as savior or complication. They invited him inside out, of courtesy more than warmth. A simple supper laid across a scarred wooden table, beans, bread, and silence thick enough to chew, and Colt felt out of place beneath the low ceiling, unused to walls that held family photographs and the scent of home. Eleanor's father spoke of land disputes, of a cattle baron from the north, who claimed the riverbed through forged papers, a man with hired guns and influence, stretching all the way to the county office, and Colt listened without offering much, but he recognized the pattern. Powerful men squeezing smaller ones until something snapped. Eleanor spoke fiercely, saying they would ride to the county clerk at first light, that the real deeds would expose the lies, and her father warned that truth did not always win against wealth and fear. And as their voices rose and fell, Colt felt the stir of an old instinct he had tried to bury, the urge to step into battles that were not his, to stand between injustice and the people it threatened. He had sworn after the war that he would not tie himself to causes again, that he would drift where the wind carried him, owing no one and expecting nothing. When the meal ended and night settled heavy around the ranch, Colt stepped outside beneath a sky scattered thick with stars, the desert air cool against his skin. He heard Eleanor's boots on the porch boards before he saw her silhouette in the doorway. She joined him without invitation, standing close enough that he could feel the heat of her presence but not touching. She thanked him at last, not with softness but with sincerity, saying he had risked his life for a stranger, and he answered that sometimes a man acts before thinking, that it was easier to pull a trigger than to ignore a cry for help. She turned toward him then, moonlight catching in her grey eyes, and asked what he would do when the men who chased her returned with more rifles and less mercy, whether he would still ride away claiming no stake in the fight, and her questions settled between them like a challenge thrown at his boots. Colt felt the old walls inside him strain, the peace he guarded built from distance and detachment. Yet here he was standing in front of a ranch worth defending, and a woman who did not hide her expectation. And as a coyote howled somewhere beyond the dry riverbed, he realized the bandits were not the only threat gathering in the dark, because the longer he stayed, the harder it would be to leave, and the peace he had carried like a shield was already slipping from his grasp, stolen not by force, but by the fierce, steady gaze of Eleanor Whitaker. Dawn came hard and red over Mercy's Run. The sky streaked like a warning, and Colt was already awake when the first rider appeared on the northern ridge, a dark speck against the light that soon split into 5, then 7, rifles glinting, horses kicking up dust like a storm rolling in. Eleanor stood beside her father in the yard, chin high though her hands trembled once before steadying, and Colt felt the old battlefield calm settle into his bones, the world narrowing to distance, angles, breath. He counted their numbers, measured the wind, and knew the bandits had not come for talk. They had come to crush defiance and reclaim pride. The lead rider called out with a voice thick from too much whiskey and too little conscience, claiming the land belonged to his employer, a cattle baron whose reach stretched beyond law and fairness, threatening fire and ruin if the deeds were not surrendered. Eleanor stepped forward before her father could answer, holding the satchel tight, declaring the land was theirs by right and proof, and the rider laughed, saying proof burned easy. That was when Colt moved, placing himself just half a step ahead of her without asking permission, his rifle rising in a smooth line. The first shot ringing out before the echo of laughter had time to fade. Chaos split the morning wide open, bullets chewing into fence posts, horses screaming, townsfolk scattering for cover. Colt fired with cold precision, dropping one rider from his saddle, forcing two more to wheel away. Eleanor dragged her father behind the water trough, then reached for a spare rifle leaning against the porch, and Colt saw it from the corner of his eye. The way she did not cower, did not collapse. She fired once, twice, not wild but measured, driving a bandit off course, and something fierce and dangerous swelled in Colt's chest, pride mixed with fear. Because brave souls drew the hardest storms, the fight stretched longer than any skirmish had a right to, smoke hanging low over the yard, until at last the remaining riders broke, retreating toward the ridge with curses swallowed by distance, one leaving a trail of blood behind him, and silence returned, slow and stunned, broken only by the crackle of a small fire licking at the edge of the barn where a stray bullet had struck oilcloth. Townsfolk emerged from hiding, faces pale but eyes lit with something new, courage borrowed from the stand they had just witnessed, and Eleanor stood in the yard with dust streaking her dress. Breathing hard yet unbowed. By noon, the county clerk arrived under escort from two wary deputies, summoned by a rider Eleanor had sent before dawn, and in the center of town beneath a sky, now clear and merciless, the deeds were unrolled and examined, signatures compared, seals inspected, the truth plain as sunlight. The cattle baron's claim built on forged lies. Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd, and when the clerk declared the Whitaker land rightful and protected by law, a cheer rose, uncertain at first, then strong. Like a community remembering how to stand upright, victory should have tasted sweet, yet Colt felt only the weight of what had shifted inside him. He watched Eleanor as townsfolk clasped her hands, gratitude shining in their faces. She met his gaze across the crowd, and there was no triumph there, only understanding. She knew as well as he did that the men who fled might return someday. That peace in places like this was never permanent. It was defended day by those willing to risk it, and she walked toward him through the thinning crowd, stopping close enough that he could see the flecks of gold hidden in her gray eyes. She thanked him again, this time without armor, saying Mercy's Run would remember what he had done, that her family would always have a place for him if he chose to stay. And the word stay hung between them heavier than any gun. Colt looked past her to the open land, stretching west, wide and tempting. The life he knew calling him back to solitude and drifting horizons. He had survived by keeping his heart unclaimed, by refusing roots that could be torn from the ground. Yet standing there he understood that peace without connection was only another kind of emptiness. Colt Maddox had saved her from bandits. That was true. But as the wind stirred dust around their boots, and the town slowly returned to its rhythm, he realized Eleanor Whitaker had stolen something from him, far more guarded than coin or comfort. She had taken the quiet distance he once relied upon, replacing it with the possibility of belonging, and after a long silence he set his rifle down against the porch rail, meeting her gaze without flinch, telling her he had ridden alone long enough, that maybe peace was not something a man protected by running, but something he built by staying. And as her hand slipped into his, steady and sure, the desert stretched wide around them, no longer empty, but full of a future neither of them would face alone. The bandits defeated, the land secured, and a restless cowboy finally choosing not the road, but the home he had almost ridden past.